Hi, welcome to Real Progressives MMT Mondays. My name is Jeff Ginter, your host. So, if you were with us last week, you saw the first several episodes of John Harvey's The Cowboy Economist. It's a bit of a comedic take on Stephen Colbert's The Colbert Report, playing the part of a conservative and telling jokes to be able to make the more compassionate liberal point of view more palatable. And I just absolutely love it. I absolutely love it. I love the comedy. I love the way he comes across. And I made a plea last week. If anyone has ideas, please let us know. I want to thank everyone, that already came in with ideas. Keep them coming. The more, the merrier. Give us your ideas. Write something yourself. Send it to us. Send it to anyone. I don't care. I don't care who gets us over the finish line. I care that we get over the finish line. So pool your resources. Do whatever you can do. Enjoy John Harvey, Part 2.
Well, howdy. I know I said I wasn't going to have a chance to make another video anytime soon, but I was wrong. And I received so many nice cards and letters from parents and so forth from my video number 1, explaining socialism. I guess I brought a lot of joy to people, explaining that their children are not necessarily spawns of Satan and that instead simply want an extension of the sort of systems we have in place already in terms of, say, for example, national defense or public police forces. Well, I was glad I'm able to do that. Today's topic, though, I want to step back a little bit and say, well, now, wait a minute, though. Let's not relax too much, because there's still some problems out there. There's communists. And I received this nice letter just a few days ago. Dear Cowboy Economist, this past Wednesday night, my preacher said that we ought to give things to the poor. Is he a communist, and should I shoot him? Signed, Miffed in Midland. Well, first of all, don't go doing things that might lead to lengthy court appearances until you're absolutely certain. So I'm going to help out with that, and let's find out, make sure that this preacher is actually a socialist. Now, step number 1, a lot of people believe that socialist and communist are the same thing. Well, they're not any more the same as Texan and American are. As we all know, Texan is a very special kind of American, in the same way that communist is a very special kind of socialist. And while we're all quite clear on what makes a Texan special, what is it that makes a communist special? That's what I'm going to tell you. Of course, we're going to have to trace this back to the works of Karl Marx. And I believe you're going to find this isn't just about sharing. It's about things like the surplus value, alienation, the labor theory of value, and so on. The whole sharing thing, I think that our Miffed in Midland viewer is thinking of Jesus. It's a totally different theory. So what's this Marx all about? Well, before I get into it, one thing I do want to say is that I know from experience that regardless of how I lay this out, there are going to be intelligent people who disagree with either my points of emphasis or my particular interpretations. And what I say to them is, go get your own camera and make your own video. I'd be loving to watch it. But in the meantime, what you're going to get from me is what I like to think of as the Cowboy Economist's largely accurate interpretation of Karl Marx. And let me explain here, first of all, why it's so difficult. Good Lord Almighty. 3 volumes of Das Kapital, which, by the way, is where we get the word capitalism. You didn't know you were a Marxist, did you? Right here is the Communist Manifesto, the Marx and Engels Reader, a necessary volume beside any bedside, and here, a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy by Karl Marx. Well, this isn't even all he wrote, so you can imagine why you get various different interpretations of Karl Marx when the guy just went on and on and on. So again, this will be mine. Well, what does he have to say? Well, first thing to bear in mind is when Karl Marx was writing. Did you know that this came out in 1848 and Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol was 1843? And indeed, my point number 1, Marx thought that capitalism caused Dickensian conditions. He was hardly alone in this. Many people in that era believed that it was capitalism that brought us things like Tiny Tim, Bob Cratchit, and Mr. Scrooge. That it pitted class against class, worker against capitalist. And that this is what was brought forth by the system of capitalism. Now, not to say that feudalism was any bed of roses. And indeed, Marx, as a follower of Hegel, believed that history was moving through stages and that it was getting better. That in many respects, capitalism was actually superior to feudalism. But it wasn't great. It wasn't good enough yet. And so what is it that Karl Marx thought we needed? What was it that was missing in capitalism? What was his utopian society going to be like? Well, I'm glad I asked that question. Marx wanted people to have more control over their lives. He thought that you should be free to choose what you produced, how you produced it, how it was used after it was produced. He thought you should be free to cooperate with your fellow worker rather than have to compete with your fellow worker. He did not believe that you should be limited to only doing things that made a profit for somebody else. He thought that you became essentially a cog in the machinery of your exploitation. Why, this is precisely how we view Bob Cratchit. That his efforts, and he was a hard-working man, his efforts were being used against him. The harder he worked, the more valuable he was to Mr. Scrooge, the more he was getting screwed by Scrooge, as I believe was the term they used back in those days. So now, again, things are going to get better at some point, but right now under capitalism, you can only do those things that'll make somebody happy and not the things that'll make you happy. Now, Marx was not the sort of person who was satisfied with simply holding up a placard that said "Down with capitalism." He wanted to understand it. He was a scholar. And so in looking at this system that he thought was constraining people's choices in their lives, he thought, well, I need to figure out the scholarly aspect of this, and who would know this better than the classical economists who first came up with these sort of capitalist type theories. For example, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And indeed, to understand capitalism, Marx turned to the classical economists. Now, you might find this kind of surprising. You might think that Marx looking to these economists for help would be like the cow looking to the butcher. But he thought they understood basically what was going on, that they just came to the wrong conclusions, that they started off on the right foot, but then ended up stepping in some cow manure. So, the particularly important part of what they talked about was what was called the labor theory of value. And what this said was, nothing of value is ever created without the expenditure of labor. That this pen right here, well, let's say it took 5 hours to make this pen. Well, then this pen's a 5-hour pen. And even the tools that we might use, that would be labor-saving tools, well, they needed labor too. They said that you trace this back, there ain't nothing that doesn't, at some level, must involve an expenditure of labor. Only labor creates value. And once again, this is not in disagreement with those economists who are pushing for capitalism, all right? So this makes this whole thing make my head spin. And so what Marx asks is this: if Mr. Scrooge is not doing any labor, why is he keeping some money? If Bob Cratchit is doing all the labor, then if only labor creates value, then why do people who do not labor get to take something? Now, if Mr. Scrooge pitches in now and then, if Mr. Scrooge says, look, I'll take out the garbage today, or let me count that stack of pennies or something like that, well, then certainly Mr. Scrooge deserves some sort of compensation for this. But he doesn't deserve compensation for simply owning. Simply owning doesn't create anything, and yet these people are skimming off the top. I use an example sometimes when I'm talking to the farmhands and explaining all this sort of thing, and God bless her, I'm sure she's a wonderful person. But Paris Hilton. Paris Hilton inherits all this wealth. She inherits ownership of the Hilton Empire. She can earn all her income while on a yacht in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, the people who work at the Hilton must go there and spend their day there. They must expend their labor at the site, and thereby, this is an unfair system. Why should she get to earn all kinds of money, and in fact a lot more money than they do, just sitting out there on her yacht in the Caribbean? This is what Karl Marx is getting to, and again, ironically, drawing right from the classical economists. All right, let's see what else we got here. Now, I know. some people might say at this point, but Bob Cratchit might not have a job if it weren't for Mr. Scrooge. And you know what? The interesting thing here is Marx might not completely disagree with you there. Because one of the points he makes is that what goes on under capitalism is just under capitalism. In other words, and I don't remember the exact quote now, but it's something along the lines of Marx says that the capitalist never takes anything that wasn't his to start with. In other words, the capitalist was entitled to profits because in the capitalist system, that's the way it works, that justice is determined by the system you're in. But then that doesn't make life any easier for Bob Cratchit. If you think about it, why under slavery, it is entirely legal for a slave owner to own another human being. But that doesn't do a lot of good for the slave. Right? So the basic idea is, even though it might be just, and even though this might be a better system than we had before, it's still not exactly a bed of roses for everybody. That these workers are being exploited and that, you know, again, capitalism, a necessary stage of history, but we're not to a point now where we truly have the choices that he thought we should have. Well, don't worry, because as it turns out, capitalism will destroy itself. Now, interestingly, as this week is St. Patrick's Day, I hung up, I'm sure many of us have an Irish flag. I have one that I keep up next to my American flag when we have our John Birch meetings and so forth. But I brought down my Irish one here to hang it up for everybody to see. So you're welcome. Now, it's going to destroy itself. But before capitalism destroys itself, it becomes immensely popular. It takes over the world, all right? Why, for example, the Chinese embracing capitalism, why, that would be right up what Marx would have said was going to happen. I mean, Marx never thought that there were going to be revolutions in places like Russia and Cuba and Vietnam and so forth. He thought that the capitalism would be immensely successful, all right? It would take over every country and every task in every country. You wouldn't be able to paint just for pleasure anymore. You got to paint for market. You get some velvet paintings of Elvis or something like that, sell them at the street corner. Once this takes place, only then will the downfall of capitalism take place. Now, there are a number of factors that apparently lead into this collapse of capitalism. I'm going to narrow it down just one in the interest of time, and it's related to this. And by the way, a lot of things in capitalism Marx thought was important in terms of productivity. Here's another one right here. Productivity ends up being a positive for what we bring with us from capitalism into socialism and communism. But productivity also destroys capitalism in a number of ways. As I say, I'm just going to pick out one here. As technology increases, so the owner of business is going to have an incentive to replace workers with machines. So this is going to start increasing unemployment and underemployment. Well, we see this today. The self-checkout line, me and the wife, we're going out to Arizona, and I was funning about riding horses. We're actually going to take an airplane. But when we get to the airport, I guarantee you we're going to have to sit there and punch it all in ourselves and so forth. Hell, we might have to fly part of the way. I don't know. So this is replacing, of course, why did they do this? Why did they put these machines in the airport that allow you to check in? Because they thought it might be fun for you? No, because they could lay somebody off. And that's the way capitalism works. We start replacing workers with machines. Unemployment goes up, underemployment goes up, and initially, the workers are among the biggest supporters of capitalism. They buy into the propaganda from the capitalists and from the government. And by the way, I sometimes hear people say, oh, the government, that's communist, that's socialist. The Marxists believe that the government is in cahoots with the capitalists. The Marxists do not see the government as their friend. They see it as their enemy. But at any rate, the workers are buying into the propaganda being put out by the capitalists and by the government until this unemployment's going up and up. And this causes pain. And of course, through pain, we have truth. I guess it's very much, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot my point number 4. Hate to think I printed it for nothing. Through pain, we get truth. This is why typically the first few albums of a band are their best ones. That's when they're suffering. That's when they can see the truth and so forth. Once they get those big record contracts, then they start putting out the crap. Well, I believe it was Roger Daltrey who once said, I hope I die before I get old. He retracted that later, but nevertheless, it was a sort of a comment on the fact that the early albums are always the best ones. And that this pain allows you to see through what's really going on in life. Well, this is what happens to unemployed people. As the unemployment rises, as their pain and misery rises, so they begin to realize, hey, wait a minute. I don't have to take this crap from Mr. Scrooge. And so Bob Cratchit will take a fireplace tool of some sort and beat Mr. Scrooge to death. He will expropriate the expropriator. And then we will move into socialism, all right? And socialism will actually look a lot like capitalism. I mean, Mr. Bob Cratchit will still go to work every day, counting things and so forth, but there won't be an ownership class anymore. Things like Exxon and Microsoft and so forth will be owned in the same way that NASA or the University of Texas is, all right? Communally, by all the people. So, but it still looks about the same. And did you know this? Marx did not think that socialism would be fair. He thought it was still an unfair system because under socialism, he figured that people would be paid about the same, but that your needs would be different. While you might not have any kids, and then somebody else got 10 kids, and then you know, or you might have the same number of kids as somebody else, but your kids are hogs and they're eating all the time or something like that. So, but one way or the other, it's still not fair. But it's better than capitalism, and that's the thing. You know, we go from slave-based society to feudalism, and he thought this was a natural tendency of the way evolution worked in human society. Slave-based feudalism, capitalism, socialism. Is socialism perfect? No, but it's getting there. It's getting to the state of the world where you get to do with your life what you want to do and not be bossed around by nobody. Now, the next point I have here is that eventually in communism, what happens is that technology goes up so much that you just have a lot more choices. That if, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here if you don't mind, just to make my point, but if in the morning you want to be a petroleum engineer, well, you can do that. And if your afternoon, well, I'd like to ride horses for my living, well, then you can do that. But you can live out your life the way you want to live it out. You can develop the skills you want, you can associate with the people you want to, and so forth. Well, think about this. To make that not too pie in the sky, if we go back 10, 20,000 years, what was your choice in life? Oh, I think I'll be a farmer. Why are you going to be a farmer? Because that's all there is, all right? So I'm going to be a farmer. Well, as society, as technology evolved, and remember Marx tacks a lot of this onto the advent of capitalism, which he thinks is superior to what happened before. Then all of a sudden, there's hardly any farmers anymore. People actually have more choices today than they did 500-600 years ago. All right, so things are better. Things are moving towards this world where we have more choices over how we live our lives, except for these problems we have with capitalism. But so capitalism destroys itself, move on to socialism, and then socialism finally evolves into communism. I think it's supposed to be 18 months later. I don't think he said anything like that. All right, so there you have communism in a nutshell. As you can see, it's a very specific set of theories and assumptions. And wanting to share things or wanting the government to provide nationalized health care or something like that, no more makes you a communist than buying a cowboy hat makes you a Texan. Now, the guy, Marx himself, was a decent fellow. He was pretty much in line with the sort of Western ideals that we have here in America, Thomas Jefferson and so forth. He had some funny notions about how history worked and that this inevitability of things getting better and so forth, but whatever. What he essentially wanted was he wanted Tiny Tim and Bob Cratchit to have control over their lives. Now, you might be thinking right now, boy, have people really screwed with what Marx originally said, and you are right. What happened in the Soviet Union, for example, didn't exactly lay out the way Marx wanted things. I think perhaps a way to think about this is the leaders of the communist revolution in Russia, kind of like Two Live Crew's third album, they were as Marxist as they want to be, which turns out to be not very much. That they basically were about as Marxist as they they said the word as often as they could. Really, what the Russian people got was they got a replacement of the Tsar and the landed aristocracy with the party commissar and the party. And the same sort of oppression, but different people oppressing you. Well, that's not real great. Now, of course, we have the same thing happening in capitalism with these ideas being twisted. While the original idea, I'm going to read to you here a little bit from Adam Smith, but the original idea with capitalism was supposed to be, it was largely anti-business and pro-consumer. And the reason being, because as Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, wrote, people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment or diversion, that the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So he's saying you can't trust the business people any further than you can throw them. So you got to set them at each other's throats. That way they please us, the consumer. All right? Now, that's the theory. What do we actually do? Well, we have a lot of people today who think that it's anti-capitalist to do things that curb business power. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. We should be making sure that businesses can't have big mergers. We should be making sure that banks have to be open with us on the assets that they're trading and so forth. But oh, no, that's anti-business, that's anti-capitalist. No, it's pro-capitalist. So we've got the same problems that they had in communism, where the original talk and then how it's being spread around through propaganda aren't the same thing. And don't even get me started on that whole Christianity thing in terms of what the Joker said in the first place and what people are doing about it afterwards. Well, I guess that's it for now. I've got to go get packed and so forth. And I want to thank you again for listening, and I hope I put some mind at ease. Well, howdy, friends. You might not be able to guess this by looking at me, but I'm a huge World War II history buff. In fact, actually, I like it more than economics. Truth be told, more than my family. I also love watching World War II documentaries, even though I pretty much know how all of them end. America comes in, saves the day. Kind of like that unhittable relief pitcher that also hits 10 home runs. Well, anyway, the other day I was watching Ken Burns' The War. Perhaps you've seen it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's just from the U.S. perspective, and it follows the trials and tribulations associated with 4 small American towns. Now, you might wonder what this has to do with economics. Well, I don't remember which episode it was, but it was well into the series. It was a lengthy segment about the remarkable achievement that Americans paid for the war on their own. And they did this through taxes and especially bond drives. This was discussed for quite some time in the episode. And they focused on the personalities behind several of the bond drives. Very interesting. But, now, I don't want to say anything bad about Ken Burns. I mean, my mama always said, don't say anything bad about Ken Burns. She's not dead, she just stopped saying it. But nevertheless, this got me to thinking about the story that the Americans paid for the war themselves. I mean, exactly what does this mean? The typical explanation is that when the government spends, this has to be offset by either taxation or borrowing. And what old Ken Burns is getting at with the bond drive narrative is that the American people were loaning money to the government whenever the government came up short. This was held up to be a monumental achievement. The implication being that Americans, if they hadn't loaned this money to the government, then some number of tanks or planes or aircraft carriers could never have been built. And what a glorious story that is. But then so's the outlaw Josie Wales. Only problem is it ain't true. Oh, it makes you feel good, but it's made up. I mean, think about it. In order for the war bonds finance the war story to be true, it must be true that Americans had sufficient spending power at the beginning of 1942, right after Pearl Harbor in December of 41, to save in the form of war bonds in the amount of $338 billion in today's terms, because that's how big the government's deficit was that year. And given that the U.S. population back in 42 was 135 million, that breaks down to each and every person saving $2,500 in the form of some sort of loan to the government, whether it be war bonds or whatever. Not per worker, not per household, but per person. Sounds like little Susan used to quit the 3rd grade and get a job. Because that's not only the way you could sell war bonds, of course. It doesn't have to be from money. It could also be from, it doesn't have to be from, say, from your paycheck. It could be something that was, you used to own some stocks or something and you sold them and then you used the proceeds to buy war bonds. But of course, that would have had a depressive effect on the stock prices, which is not the goal here. Speaking of depressive, not only do we need roughly $2,500 per person, but we were only just emerging from the Great Depression. Oh, things were better to be sure. But then if you got a rattlesnake on each arm and you shake one off, that's better too. Still ain't good. And unemployment immediately before the war was still almost 10%. 3 years before that, it had been 15, 17, and 19. 10's better, but it's not good. So where'd all these savings come from that purchased all the war bonds? Well, one might argue that they came from the wonderful defense jobs that Americans got because of the war. But then one might also be dumb as a tree stump. You see, you can't buy war bonds that build the factory with your paycheck from that factory. No, Ken, it doesn't make sense. Huh? Oh, yeah. We have a sponsor now. And now a word from our sponsor. Today's program brought to you by Well Actually, the cologne for fragile men. It's wonderful that she wants to participate in the group's discussion, but her last point was an awful good one. You should probably correct her. Who knows, you might actually be right this time. Well Actually, available at finer cigar shops and gun stores everywhere. Well, anyway, back to our story. It's hard to imagine where this money came from, since according to the standard story, it had to come before the factories were built and the jobs were created. So let's look at this whole Americans financed World War II thing from another angle. Let's say the U.S. had the resources to build all this industrial might, but no one would loan them the money. What would have happened then? We would have sat idly by? Is this the story we're being told? Having the steel, rubber, gunpowder technology and personnel necessary, but not the little scraps of paper? We would have watched Herr Hitler marching down Main Street of Fort Worth, capturing all this wonderful productivity and using it for his Nazi war machine? Of course not. Because in fact, the money's irrelevant. As you know from videos number 1 and number 2, both the private sector and the government can create money out of thin air. That's never the problem. And indeed, it wasn't in World War II either. The government didn't need to borrow anybody's money then any more than it has to now. It just created brand new money. And then they used that money to build the factories, tanks, planes, and ships. Of course, then once unemployment did fall below 2% as it did, war bonds can easily be sold. But you still got the chicken and the egg problem. And why bother? Now, this raises an issue. If the U.S. could simply print the money, then why bother selling the war bonds at all? Why have these momentous bond drives featuring celebrities and war heroes and so on? Well, a very big part of the answer is inflation. As I just mentioned, unemployment fell below 2%. And not only were these jobs, but these were good jobs. That's tons of spending power in the hands of Americans right when there was very little to buy because the resources were being diverted to the war effort. Well, what do you do to stop inflation? Well, you raise taxes, which is precisely what we did. And not because they needed the money, but to keep inflation under control. And in addition, they tried to convince people to voluntarily save, particularly patriotic saving via war bonds. Don't buy anything now, hell, there ain't nothing to buy anyway. Wait till the war's over. And that was the real purpose of the bond drives. Well, you're probably thinking right now, that's a fine piece of fiction there, Cowboy Economist, but everybody knows the truth is that the bond drives were instrumental in stopping Hitler, Tojo, and Mussolini. But let me recommend a book to you. It's called The War Bond Story by Lawrence Olney. It's available on the internet. Just search for it. It's free. Now, Lawrence Olney, this guy ain't one of them ivory tower scholars who just thinks he knows every damn thing because he has reading glasses and a snooty attitude. No, he was a career U.S. Treasury official throughout the entire war, and he was part of both the planning and execution of the bond drives. And let me give you a couple of quotes from the book. First, about the savings bond program that started in 1935. There were 3 sound objectives of the savings bond program. 1, to instill in the minds of the American people. I have a teleprompter now, so you're probably wondering, did he memorize all these quotes? No, it's right there in front of me. You can't see it, but there's words in front of you right now. I'll back up. There were 3, this is from the book. There were 3 sound, from 1935, so before the war, the savings bond program. There were 3 sound objectives from the savings bond program. 1, to instill in the minds of the American people the habit of thrift. 2, to educate the people with respect to government securities. And 3, to bind the people closer to their government, not only in financial affairs, but for its total well-being. A savings bond was a share in America. Now notice that not one of those stated in order to borrow money to cover government deficits. Rather, it was about instilling a particular attitude. Now listen to this. This is one of the important goals of the war bond program. All right, the actual, not pre-war, but the war bond program, again from the book, from page 4. There was another important objective in the minds of Secretary Morgenthau and Odegaard. Since the outbreak of the war in 1939, the American people were badly disunited. The defense bond program could provide a channel for united action and participation in national defense to eradicate differences of religion, race and class, section or party, a program in which all could work. So you see, the idea was to create a feeling of patriotism and unity. And this, I contend, is what Ken Burns is really picking up on. We didn't need the bond drives to raise the money, but we did need them to raise patriotic fervor. And it was also about inflation, as I suggested earlier. Once the war started, officials became concerned with, quote, the problem of diverting excess purchasing power. Consistent with what I said earlier, once the incomes rose and the number of goods on the store shelves fell, we were certainly setting ourselves up for some serious price increases, and the Treasury was well aware of this. Here's another quote from the book, page 27. The Secretary addressed the Advertising Club of Boston at the Statler Hotel in Boston, broadcast coast to coast by the Mutual Broadcasting System. The Secretary stated that America faced inflation and that taxes and defense bonds were the correctives. Even in some of these documents that I read here about the funding for the war, they started talking about what they called dangerous dollars. The idea that this money that was burning a hole in the pocket of Americans needed to have some sort of diversion, something to make sure that we didn't end up with terrible inflation. Now, to be sure, those working at the Treasury also viewed themselves as creating funding for the war effort. But they clearly understood that, strictly speaking, it wasn't necessary. Listen to this from page 39. The greatest single contribution the nation could make toward paying for the war was to avoid inflation. I'm going to say it again. The greatest single contribution the nation could make toward paying for the war was to avoid inflation. In other words, the message here is we could pay for it another way, but not without inflation, not without significant price increases. Now, as my last piece of evidence supporting this viewpoint, I'm going to tell you about a piece that came out after the war by a fellow named Beardsley Rummel. He was the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and so once again, a fellow that probably had some idea of how things were working. And it was in American Affairs, the journal, and his piece was entitled, Taxes for Revenue Are Obsolete. Need I say more? It was very clear to those who were actually running the war economy that we did not need taxes or war bonds, but that without them, we would face other consequences. Not the consequence of not being able to build a tank or a plane, because God knows if we had the factories and so forth out there, we were going to do what we needed to do. But the consequence of runaway inflation. And so, Mr. Burns, if I may reframe that segment of your wonderful documentary, and I mean that very sincerely, the American people did not single-handedly finance the war effort, but the American people did single-handedly make the war effort less inflationary. Thank you. Well, howdy folks, thanks for tuning back in. Hope you enjoyed my last video on how the U.S. did and did not finance World War II. I actually received a job offer from the Pentagon based on my analysis. But I feel as if you need me more than the Army does, so I'm going to stay right here. You're welcome. Speaking of helping folks, I got another letter, this time from Longview. It says here, Dear Cowboy Economist, I am an illegal immigrant and am very worried about whether or not Social Security will be there for me when I retire. Somebody told me it's running out of money. Signed, Laying Low in Longview. Well, first off, I need to warn you that as an illegal immigrant, you're not entitled to collect Social Security. You need to stop relying on Fox News and the president for your information. But second, that's a good question. Even us legals hear a lot of talk about that, and many folks are worried. Can Social Security go bankrupt? Well, the quick answer is no. It's impossible for Social Security to go bankrupt. And let me say that again. It's impossible for Social Security to go bankrupt. The concept doesn't even make any sense because the viability of Social Security has nothing to do with money. It has to do with resources. Let me offer you an example that might serve to highlight the relevant issues. Let's say there's some kind of biological or nuclear or even extraterrestrial disaster, and the only survivors were me, my wife, and 8 of my farmhands. First off, my wife's going to be awfully popular. Second, let's say that the 10 of us that are remaining here on the planet Earth decide to rebuild society and civilization, and that the level of productivity we are able to achieve is such that one person is able to produce enough goods and services for one person. It means each and every day, each one of us has to put in a full day's work just to allow each of us to survive another 24 hours. Well, how many of us can retire? Well, none of us, of course. No one can stop working because our level of productivity does not allow it. It doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, or in the case of my wife, how busy your social calendar would be. no one can stop working. Well, wait a minute. What if one day I'm out scrounging for supplies and I come across a Brinks armored car that had been unloading cash when the disaster hit? Back door wide open. Suddenly I have millions of dollars. Yay, I can retire now. Of course not. Because the ability of the working to support themselves plus some number of the non-working individuals, the young, the disabled, and so on, has nothing to do with money and everything to do with resources and productivity. Well, now let's think about this. Let's think that, well, what if we did raise our productivity? Let's say it got to the point where one person could make enough for two people to live, that we doubled our productivity. Well, now we got some choices. Everybody can enjoy twice as much, or half of us could retire while the other half kept on working, giving us half of what they made, or something in between. Now, generally speaking, societies choose the in-between. Some people don't have to work anymore, and those who are working even get to enjoy an even higher standard of living. Now, how we choose who doesn't have to work is a political and social decision. We might allow children not to work. We might allow the elderly, the infirm, hipsters. I hate working with hipsters. I'm sure you do too. If I was in charge, I'd be happy to pay them just to stay home. But the real point here is that none of these choices is available to us without sufficient productivity. And none of it depends on money, which, as I explained in videos 2 and 3, is created by a simple keystroke. That's why the whole concept of Social Security going bankrupt is irrelevant. If we have the resources and no money, we can make the money. But if we've got the money and no resources, well, then we all end up like Meghan Markle, royally screwed. Let's consider another issue that does have something to do with money. How do we stop the workers from consuming everything they've produced? How do we make sure they share something with the non-working? Well, in our simple 10-person economy, that was easy. Hey, Chris, save one of them fish you just caught for Pat. But what about in a country of millions? Well, the way we do it is we use the taxation of the working people so they can't buy everything, and then we immediately give that money as a Social Security check to the retirees so they can buy whatever the workers don't. And that's how we accomplish this goal in a country of millions. And notice that's how we actually fund Social Security. They don't hold on to your money that you paid in 20 years ago. There would be no point in doing that. No, the goal is to make sure that the workers share with the non-workers. And of course, the ultimate goal is to make sure your parents don't have to move in with you at some point. So what we do is we take money from the workers, give it to the non-workers today. Incidentally, you may not realize this, but many people depend heavily on Social Security. Prior to 1935, half of all the elderly lived in poverty. In 2013, that same number was 9%. Now, I'm sure it could be even lower than that, but it's a damn sure lower than 50%. And in 2006, 1 in 5 elderly married couples received at least 90% of their income just from Social Security. That same number for single elderly folks was 41%. And I'll bet many of them were single due to the death of a spouse. And unless they were married to a real jerk, they're already sad about it without adding poor on top of that. So here's my point. This is a critical issue. Social Security prevents a major source of poverty within a group of people who are unlikely to be able to find gainful employment anymore. And cutting Social Security funding because we don't have enough money is not only illogical, it's evil. It is a myth being perpetuated by people who are either ignorant or just plain mean. There is a financing issue, however. We do face the possibility that the current tax rate may not be sufficient to generate the revenue that we promised the retirees they would get in their Social Security checks. And it's not that we don't have the resources. That's not the problem. It's the way we set up the funding in the first place. It might leave us short. Now, of course, as you know from the earlier videos, we could solve being short with a keystroke since money is not a scarce resource for the economy as a whole, and especially for the government, but it does beg the question of why has this situation evolved? And digging into that question points out some important other factors that are actually key problems in the economy. First off, folks only pay Social Security tax on their first $132,900 of income. Now, if you earn that much, and of course that's a lot of money, but if you earn that much, then you and Bill Gates pay the same thing on the Social Security tax. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just pointing it out. Just like if you had part of your lunch still on your shirt, maybe you're saving it for later. That's not me for me to judge. I'm just letting you know. Now, the second issue, however, is much more critical. The wages from which Social Security taxes are drawn have lagged far behind productivity increases. According to the Economic Policy Institute, since 1973, productivity has increased by almost 250%. Therefore, our ability to provide Social Security has increased 250%. But over that same period, wages have only gone up by 114%. The pool from which Social Security funding is drawn has lagged way behind the actual ability to provide Social Security. And so the problem is not the tax system itself, it's the stagnation of the wages. If wages too had risen by 250%, there'd be no problem. The destruction of the middle class has had many terrible consequences. This is one of them. Bottom line, don't listen to the crap. Don't buy the arguments of those in Washington, and they come from both sides of the aisle, who say that we need to cut back on Social Security. It simply ain't true. You tell them from me to go straight to hell. Thank you. Well, howdy friends. I'm sorry it's been a while since my last video. I've been awful busy. You know how us cowboys are always branding our cattle in case they wander off or get rustled? Well, I got to thinking, what about the chickens? What about the hogs? What about my farm hands? So I set to work remedying that problem. And believe me, brother, it took a long time. It took me a week to get rid of the smell of burning feathers. And I had to write a few want ads as well. But as President Bush once said, mission accomplished. Speaking of presidents, did you hear what the current one's daughter Ivanka said just a few weeks ago? She said that people want to work for what they get. Amen, sister. I did not realize she was such a fan of the job guarantee, because that's precisely what it's all about. If you want a job, then we will guarantee that you get a job. Now one might wonder, why do we need that from the government? Why not just go down on the street and get a job? Well, the answer is simple, and it's related to what I think is one of the most misunderstood aspects of our economic system. That misunderstanding is the belief that the private sector will create enough jobs for everyone who wants to work. It won't. To explain this, let me break it down a little bit. Now, in order to get a job in the private sector, somebody must think you can make some money for them. They must think it will be profitable to hire you. For example, caring for orphans is unlikely to be a big job creator. Orphans don't have a lot of money, not very profitable. Likewise, reading to the blind or feeding the homeless. Unless we're talking about a really rich blind person or an eccentric millionaire homeless individual, those aren't going to be a lot of jobs. Now, on the other hand, I understand that many restaurants, grocery stores, and internet service providers do quite well, and good for them. Now, here's what I want to point out. All of these things that I've mentioned, from caring for orphans to providing internet services, are all worthwhile activities. But only a subset of them are likely to be profitable and therefore create a private sector job for some worker. There's my point number one. There are many, many socially useful activities, but only the ones on the green half create a job. Second point. While the private sector will create jobs related to profitable undertakings, labor is a cost for them. It is in their best interest to use as little labor as possible. Now, that doesn't make them bad people. That's just how the market system works. And given certain caveats, their cost minimization plans can work out to the advantage of all of us. But think about it. Only a subset of these useful activities create profit and therefore a job, but it's in the best interest of that green group right there to create as few jobs as possible. As the man said while walking through the cow pasture, crap. But wait, there's more. As labor-saving technology advances, as it has done for centuries, so the relationship between profitable social undertakings, the green part, and employment becomes even more tenuous. It becomes easier and easier to cut back on the use of labor. Now, some new technologies create new demands, and this actually helps employment. But others allow entrepreneurs to replace workers. Self-checkout lanes, those ordering screens at the restaurants, self-check-in kiosks at the airport, robots, computers, etc., etc. Now, don't get me wrong. All that's absolutely wonderful. We should do nothing to stop any of those processes. The problem is not the technology, nor is the problem the desire of capitalists to minimize the use of labor. Those are both fine. The problem is the common assumption that the private sector is the only legitimate means of creating employment. There appears to be a widespread belief that only the green side of this circle does anything useful. You know what falls in on the blue side? Oh, useless stuff like police, fire departments, Marines, school teachers, park rangers, fighter pilots, social service counselors, and so on. Next time you see a Marine, I dare you to tell them that what they do must not be worthwhile, because their salary comes from the government and not from profits. And when you do, you better hope there's one of them useless police officers nearby. All right, well, now let's think about solutions. Well, currently, what the government does during times of high unemployment is stuff like cutting taxes and raising spending. And those are not terrible ideas, but in general, what their goal is to stimulate the private sector enough to get it to hire those workers back. Once again, they are relying on only the socially useful activities that minimize the use of labor, that is, the green side. All right? This has proved to be inefficient and ineffective. Now, I don't have time to go into that here. It's some really fascinating research. I highly recommend the work of another rancher around here, Pavlina Cherneva. You can find her work over at what they call the Levy Institute. Real good stuff on how current deficit spending actually operates and how it doesn't tend to get to the core of the problem. Well, another solution we hear a lot about is universal basic income, where everybody is guaranteed some minimum standard of living based on what our society could provide. And I like this marginally better than the other one I just mentioned because the universal basic income tends to more effectively reach those in need. And the way we do things now, as I said, it doesn't do that. So the universal income is better. But it still leaves unaddressed the blue portion of my diagram. Who's going to be a national park ranger, public school teacher, child counselor, caregiver? Who's going to do those things that our society needs, but which has no profit associated with them? Now, some supporters of universal basic income argue that people will volunteer to do these things. Well, maybe they will, maybe they won't. At any rate, how do I even know what needs to be done in my community? Who's going to organize all this? Sounds an awful lot like them 1,000 points of light we were told years ago were going to solve all our problems. For me, it's a federal job guarantee that's much more realistic. It not only breaks our reliance on the green half of this diagram, but it directly, not via hopes and dreams, directly addresses the blue half. We have desperate needs in our country for child care, elder care, counseling, parks, city water systems, pollution cleanup. You ever heard of global warming? That's something we could put people to work in on the blue sector. Now, how does the universal basic income going to help us with that? It's not. Another integral part of the job guarantee is training. Something that a lot of college and high school students are hearing nowadays is that the job they'll be in 10 years from now probably doesn't even exist right now. How are we going to prepare for that? What happens when your particular kind of training and experience no longer fits the needs of either the blue or the green half? With the job guarantee, we train you. That's part of the way it works. And note that the definition of job under the job guarantee is intended to be flexible. The aim will not be profit, but social benefit. For example, why should somebody work 40 hours a week in order to afford to put their child in child care? Why not just stay home and do it yourself? The private sector would never create this outcome. The job guarantee will. One job could be, I'm staying home with my kids. Now, some people say, well, what about abuse? Can people take advantage of this? Well, of course they can. But two things. One, we've already got a means of dealing with public servants who don't carry their weight. And these means are, of course, not perfect, but perfect should not be the enemy of good. Second, don't forget there's plenty of abuse in the private sector too, right over there in the green part. Remember how many of the financiers got prosecuted after the financial crisis? Have you seen the price of prescription drugs lately? Do you know why we have to have a minimum wage and safety standards? The balance of power has shifted heavily in favor of business. Competition is frittered away, and what government regulations we do have are selectively applied. We should today be enjoying the highest standard of living in the history of humanity. Instead, our youth are weighed down with debt, frightened about their job prospects, and wondering whether or not they're going to even have a planet to live on. There is no reason for it. It is long past time to stop thinking that we need to rely on the green side of this circle and start filling the blue side. Thank you. Howdy. Sorry it's been so dang long since my last video. As you may have read on my Facebook or my Twitter, my mother went in for what should have been a routine colonoscopy. Ended up with a colonoscopy catastrophe. Apparently the doctor decided to do a little exploration outside the colon. That turns out to be real negative. Put her in intensive care for over a week. Didn't get back home for another 35 days. Well, she's in rehab right now and things are much better, which is why I'm back in the saddle. So on to business. Many people have asked me to evaluate the current slate of Democratic hopefuls for the 2020 presidential election. as if I'd vote for a Democrat. But I'll play along. Who would I pick? Well, I was considering doing about 10 minutes on each candidate, but wasn't sure if you had time for a 5-hour video. So I figured I'm just going to do 7 of the top runners. In order, that's going to be Joe Biden, Cory Booker, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. And again, just to be crystal clear on this, so I don't lose my stool at the Long Branch Saloon and Bait Shop, I would never be caught dead voting for a libtard, snowflake, participating, medal-loving, America-hating communist Democrat. This is just an exercise. But if we're going to do it right, I figured we need to decide what dimensions along which we're going to evaluate them. So I asked myself, what would I want from this world if I was a socialist? And I put together a quick list based on a couple of times I've seen Oprah and Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. I was just walking through the living room. My wife had them on. Anyway, I got my 7 points of evaluation. Number 1, healthcare reform. Attack the monopoly power of big pharma and health insurers and make sure that whether you live or die is no longer basically a function of how much money you have. Number 2, education reform. Stop the attacks on the public school system, the hallmark of our democracy, via vouchers, charter schools, and intentional financial starvation. Recovery of the middle class. A situation that has become so apparent that both political parties made it an issue in the 2016 campaign. And this goes beyond the middle class to the need of a living wage and financial security and retirement for all Americans. 4, private sector debt reduction. Debt levels, not just for college students, but in general. They're still today higher than they were 3 or 4 years before the financial crisis, and they are rising. This is a huge drag on economic activity and is one of the reasons why this has been the weakest expansion since World War II. 5, stop the erosion of our civil rights. Gerrymandering, closing polling stations, making it more difficult to register to vote, calling discrimination religious freedom, putting children in cages, saying there's good people on both sides, and on and on. Let's see. 6, gun violence. Well, apparently it's caused by mental illness and video games, 2 things that every other developed nation on this planet has in abundance. Wonder what the difference is in the U.S. You can have my Grand Theft Auto 5 when you pry it from my cold, dead hand. And number 7, climate change. It may already be too late to do more than damage control on climate change. So we got 7 candidates, 7 issues. Now clearly we don't have time for 49 commentaries, so what I figured I'd do is hit some critical highlights. And let me also note that generally speaking, each of the Democratic candidates is in favor of each of the above, to some extent or another. So in some ways it's a question of who can get it done. All right, so let's go in alphabetical order. We're going to start with Joe Biden, all right? So first of all, Joe, come back. First of all, I want to say that I admire him for taking such a contrary stance to President Trump by saying that poor kids can be just as smart as white ones. That's kind of edgy. Now, the Biden campaign is running on a very interesting, I'm not much different than a Republican strategy. Or in other words, Biden, the choice for those who don't think things are all that bad. In his own words, he said, the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of the members of the Democratic Party are still basically liberal to moderate Democrats in the traditional sense. I'm an Obama-Biden Democrat, man, and I'm proud of it. I think he tossed in the man to appeal to the youth crowd, particularly given that he's told them to get over it and get a job. So, my thinking is choose Biden if you want a less steep descent into hell. Cowboy Economist gives Joe Biden 1 yeehaw. What about Cory Booker? Here he is, right here. Uh-oh, what's this? Quit trying to give him money. In 2014, he got more money from pharmaceuticals than any other candidate and more than twice as much as the next closest Democrat. He also voted against a bill that would allow people to import cheaper drugs from Canada. He later called that a bad vote. I bet that made that elderly couple that committed suicide over medical costs feel a lot better. But he claims to have turned over a new leaf on that one. So what's his issue on economics? Well, he, like so many of the so-called establishment Democrats, thinks that any solution to economic problems must come from the market system. In other words, any legitimate economic government policy must make a profit for somebody. Well, I guess there goes any chance of fixing climate change. Little wonder he's also been linked to Betsy DeVos. Cowboy Economist gives Cory Booker 2 yeehaws. Next, Pete Buttigieg. Now, I practiced this. Hang on. Pete Buttigieg. Pete. That old boy Pete from Indiana. Now, Lieutenant Pete checks off most of the important boxes for an aspiring Democratic candidate. For example, he's a proponent of the Green New Deal. He advocates a single-payer health care system. And he's on the right side of most important social issues. Now, to tell you the truth, I was having a tough time nailing him down on his economics, though. And that worries me a bit because, let's say you want to get from point A to point B. Even if we all agree that point B is where we want to be, you've got to have a reliable form of locomotion. And when we're talking about economic policy, which underpins so many of the other goals the Democrats have, that means getting solid advice from economists who know what the hell they're talking about. Well, old Pete has selected Sonal Shah, a former Goldman Sachs executive. Now, that would normally be a strike against a Democratic candidate. However, she worked on environmental issues with Goldman. That said, her pedigree from London School of Economics and University of Chicago give me pause. And I can't really find any documents tying her down to a particular perspective, and I find that very frustrating. But I don't find anything that totally disqualifies her either. On that basis, Cowboy Economist gives old Pete 3 yeehaws. On to, I'm terribly sorry. I printed this up for old Pete, and then I didn't use it. All right. To Kamala Harris. One may wonder, where is his left hand? It's on the thing that controls the, what you call that thing right there I'm looking at? Teleprompter. It's on the teleprompter. Our president doesn't use those. He can memorize everything. Me, I got to use teleprompter. All right, so I'm down here moving it. Now, on to Kamala Harris. Whoa there, counselor. Much like old Pete, she's on the right side of what your average pansy liberal wants in life. However, some of her decisions as a prosecutor, district attorney, and state attorney general have come under fire. Indeed, rather than a consistent track record of being what she says is a progressive, she's done some things that me and my friends would like. 1, dragging her feet on getting falsely convicted people freed. 2, enforcing harsh anti-truancy laws that threaten the parents of kids with prosecution and punishment. And 3, resisting attempts to hold police and prosecutors responsible for misconduct. Well, hell, I might vote Democrat after all. But to be fair, one has to consider the context in these issues. However, in a crowded field, I'm sure this will give some of those libtards some second thoughts. Cowboy Economist gives Kamala Harris 3 yeehaws. Well, finally, on to a Texan. Fellow Texan Beto O'Rourke. His entry into the race seemed a little bit like, hey, why is everybody else running for president? I want to do that too. His initial platform seemed to consist of the fact that he was a Democrat and he looked a bit like Bobby Kennedy. And that was about it. Luckily, he's filled in some gaps for us since then. Now, on social issues, I don't think you're going to see any big differences between him and the others. Although he's not quite ready to go all in on the single-payer health care thing. Indeed, that's very consistent with his insistence that only markets can possibly save our economy. Can you say neoliberal? Don't get me wrong, seems like a good guy. And hell, I was listening to punk rock way back before his first arrest. But if I was voting Democrat, and I'm not, I'd sure want somebody who had a plan before he declared his candidacy. And I don't want somebody who falls over himself to please those free marketers. I guess he's kind of the young person's Joe Biden. I'll give him 2 yeehaws. Now, Bernie Sanders, that damn socialist. Did you know that he's in favor of the social ownership of the means of production? Well, but actually he's not. And since that's what a socialist wants, and since Sanders isn't for it, I guess he's not a socialist. God, I hate thinking. Anyway, in stark contrast to Beto O'Rourke, the big knock on Sanders is his long and consistent policy stances reaching back decades. He was recently criticized for saying nothing new, but his ruffled self responded that we still have the same damn problems. When they change, I'm going to change my message. Now, you may actually remember Sanders from the last presidential campaign when he got super delegated out of the running and we got super screwed in the election with the Cheeto-in-chief. But I digress. Again, Sanders falls in line with the others on social issues. He's for universal health care, Green New Deal, gun control, banking reform, campaign reform, etc., etc. What really distinguishes him, above and beyond the fact that he's been consistently preaching this same message for decades, is that he is the one and only candidate that has been advised by an economist who knows what the hell she's talking about. I think that's very important. Regardless of what candidates say and mean during the campaign, stuff that they didn't expect is going to happen once they take office. And B, they depend heavily, as they should, on experts for sound advice. So no matter how well-intentioned you are, you have to have a sound plan based on good advice. And Professor Stephanie Kelton, a key Sanders advisor, is the only one not drawn from the pool of economists known as neoliberals. She knows what the hell she's doing, and she would deliver the kind of economy necessary to support the programs that the Democratic Party endorses, which of course I'm against. I give Sanders, hold on, I give him 5 yeehaws. I only give 5. That's as many as I've got, right? So, oh, and I'm terribly sorry. I forgot this and this. This ink costs a lot of money. All right. Elizabeth Warren. Now, she and Sanders have been leading the charge as the party's top senior progressives, whatever the hell that word means, for some time now. And as such, you won't see the Venn diagrams of policy stances intersect for any of the two candidates more than they do for Sanders and Warren. That said, returning to the issue of advisors, hers are pretty mainstream. If you look over the resumes of Drs. Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, you'll see nothing but mainstream journal publications there. More neoliberals, more dinos, more Republican light. Now, I don't want to lay into her too much, as on this issue, she appears to be head and shoulders above many of the others in terms of her ability to intelligently analyze what is brought to her and to pick and choose wisely. Nevertheless, tends to come down very much, and nevertheless come down very much in Bernie Sanders' territory, but it's still a little concerning. I'm going to give her 4 yeehaws. Well, there you have it, folks. Now, don't get me wrong, a brain-dead rhesus monkey would serve us all a lot better than the current Oval Office resident, and certainly tweet a lot less and more intelligently. And American farmers would still have a market. But I believe we're at a pivotal point in history. It's increasingly evident that the time to act is very short and maybe even past us. If we stand a chance of avoiding being Trump's next TV reality show, Survivor Planet Earth, then the time for compromised candidates is over. And in my considered cowboy opinion, it's Bernie Sanders, possibly Elizabeth Warren, but none of the others even come close. All this is, of course, if I vote a Democrat, which I don't. Thank you, and good night. Well, howdy, y'all. It's me again. Now, I hope to get back to talking about the economy real soon, but I wanted to say one more thing about them Democratic presidential candidates. Now, as I hope I made clear in my last video, there's no way I'd ever vote for one. I mean, I'm a God-fearing Texan who treasures not being ostracized by my neighbors. But let's pretend for just a moment that I might vote Democrat. Well, let's see. In my last video, I already gave you my reviews of each of the candidates. Bernie Sanders got himself 5 yeehaws. Elizabeth Warren, 4. Kamala Harris, 3. Now, Pete Buttigieg also got 3, but he's down to 2 now since I heard him saying something bad about the national debt. Cory Booker, Beto O'Rourke, they each got 2. And Joe Biden got 1 yeehaw. You know, but I'll bet Joe would still give me a hug, whether I wanted one or not. So there's my ranking. Now, what the hell am I on about now? Well, I've been hearing a lot from these liberal socialist types that even if my ranking is accurate, those that I have at the top couldn't win anyway. We should therefore vote for one of the less competent candidates on the assumption that they have a better chance of beating President Trump. Well, let's think about this. First of all, where do we stand right now in the world? Well, in the United States of America, per capita healthcare spending is the highest it is anywhere else on the planet, and yet we have the worst infant mortality and life expectancy of any developed nation, and frankly below some developing nations. Income distributions continue to be horribly uneven despite the apparent concern of both parties with this issue in the previous election. Private sector debt levels remain well above where they were just a few years before the financial crisis. Hell, capitalism appears to be trying to starve itself by attacking the consumer class. And speaking of starving, state and local governments have been starved, particularly the educational system. In fact, the educational system has often been blamed for the consequent shortcomings because they were starved and then punished by being starved even more. Why don't we do that when a weapons system doesn't work? Hatred and racism are on the rise, and both now feel sufficiently confident to parade their views and sometimes act on them in very vicious ways in the open. And ironically, the information age has led to widespread ignorance, including a resurgence of contagious and deadly diseases because people believe that Facebook posts are more reliable than information from the Center for Disease Control. The ongoing trade war has cost American businesses and markets they might never get back again. Our nation is polarized, as is the government, which is also paralyzed. We are currently averaging more than 1 mass shooting per day. And the timeline on climate change may have reached the point where we can only do damage control, and yet we're rolling back environmental protections. In short, we're screwed. And this upcoming presidential election is not about, oh gosh, I wish GDP growth were 1% higher, or oh golly gee, I'm disappointed that my favorite PBS show got canceled. We need a new president. No, ladies and gentlemen, we are facing global disaster, global catastrophe. And the question is no longer who could beat Trump. That's not enough anymore. It's who can solve the problems we're facing. I mean, look at here, it's like this. Let's say little Susie gets bit by a rattler, and the poison is spreading quickly. And if we can't get her to old Doc Hibbert in Dodge City, she ain't gonna make it. Now, Dodge City, however, is 40 miles away. And all we have available for transportation are a mule and 2 horses. Now, the mule, his name is Donald. I know it's not a mule, but it's close I could get. Donald. And not only is he slow, but he's not very bright. He might end up just carrying Susie back for a rattlesnake reunion. Then we got a horse named Old Joe. Now, Joe's a real gentlefeller. He's easy to put a saddle on. He has a nice and steady gait. There's no question we can get Susie safely up on his back and on her way to Dodge. And he'll get her there in plenty of time for the coroner to determine cause of death. Joe ain't exactly fast. Finally, there's Lightning. Now, Lightning runs like the wind. However, he is a free spirit. You can saddle him, but it can be a struggle. That said, if you get that saddle on Lightning and you get little Susie up there for the ride, they'll be in Dodge City so fast you can have a quick beer at the Long Branch Saloon before stopping in to let Doc Hibbert save her life. So, which animal do you choose? Donald, Old Joe, or Lightning? It's not really a choice, is there? Because the goal is not simply to make sure that the mule is not selected. The goal is to make sure that Susie is saved. People need to stop pretending that the current resident of the White House is the only problem we have and that replacing an elephant with a donkey will be sufficient. It won't be. If we don't get somebody in office who realizes that the market system is not the only legitimate or effective means of solving the problems facing humanity, I'm talking to you, Joe and Corey and Beto, the private sector's got no incentive to solve climate change. And someone who knows that the public sector's deficit and debt is the private sector's surplus and asset, and that the United States government cannot possibly default on debt denominated in dollars. Hey, Pete Buttigieg, no, it's not, quote, a problem that has to be taken seriously, then we're screwed. And I don't know of a single Democratic candidate other than Sanders whose economic advisor clearly understands all this and who can therefore harness our productive capacity in a manner that will take on these issues. I wish I did. I wish I had 20 choices that made me feel safe and that I was only picking and choosing on the basis of whether or not they looked good on TV or supported my pet program. But I don't see that choice. Sanders is head and shoulders above the rest, followed by Warren. I want to like Warren more. But her economic advisors regularly publish in those same academic journals that brought us wonderful things like the repeal of Glass-Steagall and welfare reform, both of which occurred during a Democratic presidency, I might add. So let me say it one more time so I can move on to economic issues again. The question at hand is not who can beat Donald Trump. There are plenty of incompetents who can do just that. The question is who can address the deep-seated and potentially catastrophic problems facing us today. That has to be number one. We are about out of time. Hell, we may already be out of time. Who knows? Thank you.
Hi, welcome back. Thanks for watching John Harvey, part two. What did you think? What stood out for you? What was the best part? For me, it's just about the comedy. It's about the way he takes these complex, concepts and puts them together in a way that's easily digestible, so that even conservatives can start to get the idea. What did you find, in these little snippets? Did you find anything that would help you move forward in your discussion of MMT, in trying to educate people about MMT? Let us know in the comments. We'll be back next week.